Hey everyone, it's Professor Clark, and in this lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about syllabotonic verse and meter in Russian poetry. A lot of Americans do not learn this in school, and so this is a big shock to people when they encounter it. But this is how Russian poetry is written, and it's important to understand it, to understand Russian poetry, and also because it's incredibly helpful when learning about stress. I'm sure you know enough Russian already to be very stressed out about stress. Learning poetry and learning about how meter is used in Russian poetry can be a helpful way to start to get a handle on Russian word stress. So bear that in mind as we plunge into what is probably going to be a total house of horrors for many of you. But don't worry, it will make sense. By the end of the semester, it will all make sense. So, as I mentioned in the lecture about the development of the Russian alphabet and the Russian literary language, starting in the 18th century, Russian poetry was written in the syllabotonic style. And what that means is that lines of poetry had fixed numbers of syllables and fixed numbers and places of stresses. So in modern Russian poetry, and they still write this way today, a lot of the time, each line of poetry will have a very specific rhythm or meter that will have a fixed and specific number of syllables. And then within that specific number of syllables, the stresses will fall in predetermined places within the line, so on specific syllables. And this is syllabotonic poetry. We also have a history of syllabotonic poetry in English, so all of that Shakespearean iambic pentameter that you probably have been exposed to, that is syllabotonic poetry as well. Iambic pentameter is a syllabotonic meter. Remember, it just means it's got a fixed number of syllables and a fixed position of stresses, syllabotonic. And when you have syllabotonic meter, each line of verse is composed of what we call feet in English or stolpy in Russian. And fun fact, the word stapa in Russian means foot, both a metrical foot and the foot at the end of your leg, just like it does in English. But, and this is where we start to have fun with Russian stress, the nominative plural of feet when they're the feet at the end of your legs is stapli, and the nominative plural when they're feet as in the feet in a line of poetry is stolpy. So the stress shifts when we're talking about metrical feet, but not when we're talking about physical feet. Fun fact that I just learned actually preparing for this lecture. So in syllabotonic poetry, each line of verse is composed of feet. And so you talk about how many feet there are per line of verse. And each foot is made up of one stressed syllable and one or two unstressed syllables. So basically each stress creates a foot, and then that stress is going to have with it either one or two unstressed syllables as well. And that unit is called the foot. And the stressed and unstressed syllables must fall in the same place in each foot. And there will be examples in the next slide. So you'll see like what that actually means. But in this type of syllabotonic poetry that we're dealing with here, the feet are regular. And so they're each going to have the stress in the same place and the unstressed syllable in the same place in each foot. So again, it's very regular and predictable, and once you learn it, you know where the stresses go when you're reading Russian poetry. It's so fabulous. And then line length is measured by the number of feet in the line. So iambic pentameter, for example, has 5 iambic feet in it. And that's what iambic pentameter means. And you could have any number of feet in a line, but most Russian poetry is written in lines of 3 to 6 feet. So trimeter, tetrameter, pentameter, and hexameter, with tetrameter being the most common. So in English, pentameter is the most common, 5 feet. In Russian, tetrameter is the most common, 4 feet. But you can have anything from 3 to 6, and every now and then you'll encounter shorter lines or longer lines up to octameter. It's very rare to have anything longer than an octameter. It's even very rare to have an octameter. Normally they stop at hexameter because after that it just gets unwieldy and out of control. So remember when you're dealing with feet and lines that if you're not sure, there's an excellent chance that they're going to be between 3 and 6 feet long, meaning metrical feet. So they will have 3 to 6 stresses per line. And so that's stopy, metrical feet. There are 2 main types of feet or meters in Russian poetry, also in English poetry. This is all borrowed from classical Greek poetry. And you can have двусложные размеры or binary meters, and they have 2 syllables per foot. So each foot is going to be a unit of 2 syllables, and there are 2 main binary meters. Iambs, as in iambic pentameter, in Russian called yambly, and trochees, in Russian called chori. And iambs, again, are what we're most used to in English, and they are also the most popular meter in Russian. And they have an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. So, for example, the line "Друзья мои" is in iambic. We have unstressed syllable, stressed syllable, unstressed syllable, stressed syllable. In other words, the stresses will fall on the even syllables. With iambs, the stresses have to fall on the even syllables. Trochees also have 2 syllables per foot, but in their case, you start with a stressed syllable and followed by an unstressed syllable. So, всё моё is a trochaic line. The stresses in trochaic lines will always fall on the odd syllables. So with iambs, you have the stresses on the even syllables. In trochees, the stresses fall on the odd syllables. And in the graphic that we have here on the right, it shows you binary meters, and they have trochees on the top, and you can see how it shows the stress and followed by that little sort of U-y shape thing, which is the symbol for an unstressed syllable in poetry. And then at the bottom, they have an iamb, and so they have the little U-y shape thing, which is the symbol for an unstressed syllable in poetry, followed by a stressed syllable. And so you have a trochaic foot on the top, so stress, unstress, followed by an iambic foot on the bottom, so unstressed, stress. And again, this might seem like it's just coming at you thick and fast and it's all madness. Once you start to see examples and get a feel for the rhythm, it should start to make a lot more sense. Because remember, this is all about rhythm, and this is just a way of creating a consistent rhythm in a line to actually make it easier to pronounce and easier to remember. And in fact, you can sort of hum or sing the different meters to help you remember them. So an iamb is going to be da-dot, 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 da-dot. So unstressed, stress, unstressed, stress. Da-dot, 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 da-dot. Whereas a trochee is going to be dot, 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 dot. You can hear the difference. It's very clear. So remember iamb, da-dot, 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 da-dot. Trochee, dot, 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 dot. And again, talking about it might make it seem confusing. When you actually hear it, it's just like listening to music. It makes a lot of sense. Russian versification also uses ternary meters. They're much less popular than binary meters, just like they are in English, but they do still use them. We will see some examples. And in some ways, they're more traditionally Russian, closer to the traditional Russian folk style than the binary meters that are so popular with modern literary Russian poetry. Ternary meters, or трехсложные размеры, are, as you might guess, meters formed with 3 syllables per foot. So each foot is still only going to have 1 stress, but that stress is going to be combined with 2 unstressed syllables. And so there are 3 main ternary meters used in Russian versification: dactyls or dactyli, amphibrachts or amphibrachii, and anapasts or anapisti. And dactyls have the stressed syllable at the beginning, and then the 2 unstressed syllables follow after it, but like a tail. So, for example, the phrase «дикая грозная» is in dactyls. Amphibrachs have a stressed syllable between 2 unstressed syllables. So, for example, the phrase что смолкнул веселье глаз is in amphibrachts. And anapasts have two unstressed syllables followed by a stressed syllable, so they're the opposite of dactyls. They're like a backwards dactyl. For example, the line, "Oh, весна без конца" is in anapasts. And really, with ternary meter, once you get into the middle of the line, they're all the same because it's stress, unstress, unstress, stress, unstress, unstress, stress. So the only difference is at the beginning or the end of the line. And so you just want to look and see where the first stress is and where the last stress is in the line. And that will tell you whether you have a dactyl, an amphibrach, or an anapast. And again, you can treat these like music. They are very similar to music, and you can sort of hum or sing along. And so a dactyl is going to be da 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 da. An amphibrach is basically going to sound the same, but you're going to start with an unstressed syllable. So da 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 da. While the anapast is probably going to sound quite familiar because it goes da 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 da. And it is the meter commonly used in limericks. English limericks, they normally have this sort of anapestic tendency, although frequently with some amphibrach as well. So here's a limerick that I found on the Wikipedia page about limericks that goes, "The limerick packs laughs anatomical into space that is quite economical. But the good ones I've seen so seldom are clean, and the clean ones so seldom are comical." And the first line is amphibrachic, the second line is anapestic, the third line is anapestic, the fourth line is sort of amphibrachic again, and the fifth line is anapestic. So if you sort of think of the limerick rhythm, that will give you this kind of anapestic rhythm, although sometimes with amphibrachic tendencies. And so there you have an introduction to the basic Russian meters. That might have seemed like a lot of crazy, crazy info dumping, and you'll never learn it. The real thing is just to start reading the poems out loud, and also when you're reading them in print, to look at the stresses and really start paying attention to where the stresses fall and how the words sound. And so while after this class, you may never have to recognize iambic tetrameter versus anapestic trimeter again in your life, what you will learn that you will need to use a lot if you continue to use Russian or any kind of Slavic language is a close attention to stress and rhythm and how the words actually sound and where the stresses fall. So hopefully, even if you find the experience of learning about meter and learning to recognize meter to be excruciatingly painful. Some people love it. Some people find it just almost unbearably painful. Hopefully, even if you're one of the unlucky souls who finds it almost unbearably painful, the benefits it will give you as far as understanding how stress works and the rhythm of Russian speech will continue to carry on for a long time after this.